Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 5 chapters, cinque capitoli. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land which we are meeting on and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today we are here to explore the Italian diaspora and the creative collaboration. The panel will go through the artistic and literary collaborations that are forged and the connections across 3 continents with the Italian diaspora. So let me introduce the panel. So, Fred Gardaphe is a distinguished professor of English and Italian American Studies of Queen's College and the John de Calandra Italian American Institute. He is a Fulbright Fellow of the University of Salerno in Italy and past president of the Italian American Association. A writer to numerous books, and he has completed a study of humour and irony in Italian American culture that will be published shortly. We also have Loredana Polezzi. Loredana joined Stony Brook University as Alfonso Di Marto Chair in Italian and Italian American Studies in September 2020 from Gardaphe University, where she remains Honorary Professor of Translation Studies in School of Modern Languages. Her work sits in the intersection of translation, multilingualism, and mobility studies. She's co-editor of a leading international journal, The Translator, and one of the founding editors of Transnational Modern Languages book series. We also have Luci Callipari-Marcuzzo, a multidisciplinary artist, mother, researcher, arts worker, curator, and writer based here in Mildura. Her work actively engages her famil and feminine history, a manifestation of hopes, dreams, and desires of migrant women and also their lived realities. She strives to honour the voices of women, which were often silenced by dominant gender roles within the Italian Calabrian diaspora. Luci is also a gallery and heritage team leader here at Mildura Arts Centre and has led as curator working closely with Filomena Coppola, who allow me to introduce the artist who has brought us all together here today as part of her celebration of her exhibition. Filomena Coppola is an artist and educator who works between Melbourne and Mildura. Her artwork is a response to being born in a regional town of Mildura to Italian parents who migrated to Australia after World War II. Her work celebrates migration experiences, explores cultural loss and grief, as well as expressing the complexities of living between the culture she was born in and the one that her parents left behind. So, without further ado, I'll pass over to Filomena.
I'd like to say a few thank yous before I start. A thank you to the Mildura Arts Centre for supporting my application for this exhibition, which included this panel discussion and the public programs where we're inviting members of the Italian community to add their names to my drawing Alpha Sound. Eliana Maestri reminded me of an interview that she recorded with me 10 years ago where it said that it was my dream to exhibit these 3 major works, Chasing the Disappeared, Mother Tongue, Alpha Sound, together in one space. And I thank the Mildura Arts Centre for supporting this exhibition with a catalogue. Thank you to Antoinette Zima, to Janae Connell, Mark and the tech team here today, as well as Robert Claridge, who is behind the camera today and has been behind the camera in much of the work upstairs. I want to thank especially the panel members for accepting this invitation to participate in this discussion, Loredana Polezzi and Fred Gardaphe for travelling to Mildura from the United States to participate in person, and for their continued interest and collaboration with 2 Italian-Australian artists from Mildura. And a big thank you to Luci Callipari-Marcuzzo, not just for her creative work and writing, but also for her support in this organisational feat. The stories that we are sharing today are our stories and our experience of the Italian diaspora. As I look around this room, there are so many more stories from the Italian diaspora, as well as from other cultural diasporas, that are being shared through writing, research, food, gardening, performance and visually. These stories touch us all and invite us to bear witness to those who have transplanted themselves into new communities and how these journeys have enriched us all. The very unfortunate part of my day today is to apologise for the absence of our colleague and dear friend Eliana Maestri. She sends her apologies as she's currently on sick leave. I know that she is devastated at not being able to come to Australia to see the exhibition, to present on this panel and support her colleagues and contribute to this discussion today. Eliana's research focuses on Australian Italian artists and the conversations that they create through their work. She interviewed me 10 years ago in Melbourne, just after I'd exhibited Mother Tongue for the first time as part of Palimpsest No. 9. 10 years later, I asked Eliana to contribute to the catalogue essay for this exhibition because of her sensitivity and understanding of the complexities that I bring to the work. She interrogates, interprets, and seeks to understand and explore not just the work, but the artist as well. I'm truly grateful for such a profound catalogue essay, Art as Generosity, that is academic, personal, sensitive, and enriches the experience of my work through the gift of her writing. Eliana has written on a number of Italian Australian artists, and a selection of these artists will be included in her forthcoming book. I will read a paragraph from a chapter published in Transcultural Italy's titled Visual Spatialisation at Crossroads Between Translation and Mobility, Italian Australian artist John Cadapan's Cityscapes, which provides an insight into Eliana's research, questioning and interest in understanding the work of Italian Australian artists. As she cannot be here in person, I really want to honour the depth of her support and contribution to the catalogue, the conversation about our work over the decade, and her commitment to making space for the discussion of Italian Australian artists and the contribution through her work. In her essay on John Cadapan, she asks, how do Australian artists of Italian descent display their journeys across continents and imaginary lands? How do their travels to European and non-European destinations help them translate and visualise the transcultural discourses of their parents' country of origin? Situated within the web of global connections, how do they interpret their hybrid identity, translate their multi-layered life narratives into visual artworks, and contribute to the problematisation of Italian culture, constantly redesigned by mobility, movement, and migration? As roots are forms of narration providing routes throughout the world, how do they engage with cultural and linguistic constructs across borders while straddling manifold worlds? As they are also speakers of languages, they are rooted to a place that is a translated space. How does their competence in the Italian language contribute to their visual translation and mediation of perceptions of Italy and other cultures? Being part of an inspiring multicultural makeup in Australia and the receivers of practices of migration and conservation of Italian traditions, these artists display a thought-provoking translation of the Italian diaspora in a global context. Intrigued by Italian culture and the familiar Italian spaces, the second and subsequent generations have performed the complex role of transnational and transcultural mediators. As Michael Cronin and Sherry Simon confirm, mediators are involved in a range of activities which exceeds mere translation. They are multilingual authors, self-translators, and often active in a variety of intercultural and inter-artistic networks, often migrants with hybrid identities who develop transfer activities in several geocultural spaces. Whereas the Italian Australian artists' national transnational interests have led them to navigate worlds across continental borders and trace. As Rita Wilson argues, the dialectic between the local and the global, their transcultural position has helped them negotiate meaning specifically between Italian generations, spaces and languages. Eliana asked me to read a passage from her catalogue essay for 5 letters, cinque lettere, which is titled Art as Generosity. And so I conclude with this piece, which is the conclusion of the essay. Communities are made of individuals whose values, if dissimilar, can make a difference. Individuals driven by generosity are open to challenges, are prepared to respect the other as other, and willing to venture into the unknown with joy, creativity, and fears. The migrants portrayed in Filomena's work and the individuals that have inspired her art are givers, just like her. They offer, they provide, they donate, they dare, and they venture. In this light, Filomena's work is a commemoration of her beloved father, a generous migrant, a generous man, whose mobility has not limited him. On the contrary, it has empowered him and those following in his footsteps in search of his beautiful garden.
Okay, so first slide, please, Jessie.
Shall I start?
You start.
Okay, so as you heard, my name is Loredana Polezzi, and I arrived here in Mildura for the first time yesterday, coming from the United States. And I first of all want to thank you for being here. Want to thank the Art Centre for having us. Want to thank Luci and Filomena for 10 years of incredible conversations and as you will see, Luci and I, who are opening this, and then you'll get the main act, Filomena herself and Fred. But as you will see, Luci and I decided to literally do this part of today's discussion as a conversation, because that's what this has been from the beginning. So I arrived in Mildura yesterday, and for me it was like arriving in, I don't know, El Dorado. It's a mythical place. I've been talking about this place. I've been thinking about this place. I've been seeing images of this place. I've known people from this place for 10 years now. And when I arrived yesterday, I literally arrived among friends, and there are so many faces in the audience that I already know, and others that I've just, other people that I've just met, but whose stories I've heard, or whose stories I've been hearing bits of, whose pictures I've seen, whose work I've seen before. So first of all, thank you. And then, yes, a little bit about me. I'm based in the United States. Before that, I was based for 33 years. For those of you of Italian descent, as we say in Italian, gli anni di Cristo, 33 anni, okay? 33 years in the UK. Originally, I come from Tuscany. I come from one of the Tuscan hill towns, Cortona. In the United States, I often say, you know the song that José Feliciano made famous? Que sarà, que sarà, que sarà. It was written about my town, and it was written from a window looking from a window that is more or less 200 meters from the window that I looked out of when I was looking at that town. So it's a famous town, but it's a small place. Like Mildura, it's a famous small place. It's another El Dorado for me. And then, so in that sense, I absolutely am part of the Italian diaspora. I'm a first generation diasporic Italian. I don't often but I don't often talk of myself as a migrant, because migrant implies other things. I know that I'm a privileged migrant in many ways. I had the privilege of education. I had the privilege of traveling on my own terms. I have the privilege of coming to places and having friends there. So today we're going to tell you, with Luci, we're going to tell you a few stories, indeed. We're going to tell you stories that have to do with at least 3 continents, as you were saying earlier. And I think one of the important things is, again, to try and communicate the fact that what we're talking about, whilst absolutely important and whilst absolutely part of our history, is also very, very personal. Hence, also the decision to make this a conversation. Over to you.
Sorry, I just realised I did something that I wasn't supposed to do. I had my microphone on and I was whispering. It's all good. As Antoinette mentioned earlier, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, writer, curator, work here at Mildura Arts Centre, and through multiplicitous methodologies, my work actively engages with my familial and feminine history. And a big part of that is my self-transformation into an imagined version of my Calabrese grandmothers. I have to say that it's pretty amazing to have Loredana and Fred here in Mildura. Yesterday was like, I don't know, we were saying El Dorado, it was like this surreal scene where you appeared, you know, out of the aeroplane. Yeah, you know, because we have been saying, come to Mildura, you know, and then it was, you know, from Filomena's invitation that actually happened. So it has been pretty amazing. And thank you. So I'm losing track already, Loredana. So we'll move on to the next slide.
So, okay, we said it's about a conversation, and we're going to give you a little sense, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail, but a little sense of how that conversation started and where it's taken us. It was about 10 years ago, end of 2014, beginning of 2015, and I just started on a big project. It was a huge project with 10, 15 people involved, which was called TML for short, because it had an unpronounceable title, Transnationalizing Modern Languages, and you don't want to know the subtitle, it was even worse. And I got an email out of the blue from someone I didn't know anything about, and that someone was Luci. And she wrote and said, I've just heard about this project, and it sounds really interesting. And from that, we literally started first an email conversation and then a Zoom conversation. There is somewhere lost in a folder in somebody's computer, there is actually an interview I did with Luci at that time, because I was really so interested in the work that she was doing. And that led me, you sent me with the email, she sent me a link to a video. And in that video, Luci, and she's going to talk about her transformations, but Luci was in costume for one of her performances. And she was sitting by a sewing machine, and then she was talking about that machine as a translation machine. And like Eliana, whom again at the same time Eliana was starting the conversation with Filomena, and Eliana and I have that in common. We're both specialists in translation, and with an interest in migration, with an interest in visual arts, with an interest in diasporic identities and subjectivities. And so that moment, this woman talking about that sewing machine, I'm the daughter of a seamstress, by the way. So this woman at the other end of the world talking about that machine as a translation machine really captured my imagination. And I want to pay tribute now at the beginning, and then we'll carry on. But to both Luci and Filomena, they have really helped me to think through some of the most difficult concepts that I've tried to think through. And one of the questions, Filomena was reading some of the questions that Eliana is asking in her research, and one of the questions I kept asking was, what does it mean to talk about translation, especially when we're talking not about text, but we're talking about people? And if we think of translation traditionally as something that substitutes for something else, so you have a text and then you have another one in another language that substitutes the previous one, and you don't see that one any longer, you don't hear it any longer. What does that mean when it's people? What are we asking people to do? To erase themselves and translate themselves into something else? How can we think about that in a way that is more constructive, more inclusive, more collaborative than that? And over 10 years, I've really thought through that, through the work of these women, and through the eyes of these women. And then we've met again. We met again. So we never met up to that point. Then we met in Rome. Then we met again in the United States. Then we met, in Genoa first, and in the United States, all over the place. We'll tell you a bit more about that trajectory. But you have a picture of a room in Melbourne where we were all there. So there's me, there's Luci's family, there's Filomena, and the last one there is Eliana, whom we so
Up
much
in the corner.
hope could have been here, but the one at the front.
And other members of my family were in that audience as well, including Eleanor and Fortunata and Elena. So.
And Fred, I think you were in there somewhere. But
out of shot. I think Fred was out of shot somewhere.
Yeah.
He was so it's a great photo. And there's Christian, my son, videoing the whole thing. So we'll move on to the next slide. So this is part of my process of transformation. So my inspiration are my two grandmothers, my nonnas, my nonna Domenica, who's on the left, and my nonna Elena, who's on the right, whom all of the Elenas and Elenas are named after. So we have a lot of Elenas and Elenas in my family. And then that's part of my process. So in those photos of myself, I'm transforming myself into a version of them, and wearing the same dress that my Nonna Domenica is wearing on the left. So I'm fortunate that we have that still. And this is the performance. Loredana was talking about Rome, and this is the performance I did as part of the Transnationalising Modern Languages project exhibition called Beyond Borders, which was curated by Viviana Gravano and Giulia Greci. They're two Italian curators, and that was at the British School at Rome. And I was really fortunate to get some funding from La Trobe University, where I was doing my master's at the time, Master of Visual Arts, to document that performance, as well as I got a travel grant to enable my travel to Rome, to Italy at the time, and that experience was really
There are
amazing.
lots of stories about that particular event, where a lot of us met, and that event, again, this is a conversation and it is personal, and so lots of things come from meeting other people, and lots of things will come from meeting people here today, I'm sure. But there, Fred was there, and Fred met colleagues from the Coasit and the Italian the Historical Museum in Melbourne. Paolo was there, and from that a whole series of other events, the Diaspora Italiana series of conferences came, and that's where eventually I met Filomena in person. So there's a link here. But I also wanted to say, about Lucy's performance there and that transformation, seeing her, and it's a transformation that is not a masquerade, but it's a way of honoring a tradition and honoring a female genealogy in particular, and making those gestures and those images and those objects, and we'll talk about objects a bit more in a second, but making those objects come alive and underlining their significance and the way in which they transmit memory, but also change over time. So I think Lucy's performances for me have been illuminating. I remember you sitting people down in a circle to do tombolo, to do ricamo, embroidery in Melbourne, and there have been other occasions. And there's that way in which also traditionally women's crafts were linked to women's conversations. And the importance of that, the importance of the visual element, but also the importance of the embodied element, and the importance of this spoken element, which is something that, again, always comes up in Filomena's work. The way in which words spoken and written, the way in which embroidery, cucito, needlework, all these kinds of crafts come into the creation of new art. For me, these things have been truly inspirational.
Yeah, so we have a number of anecdotes from Rome. One of them is that we first met Maria PC, Maria Pilotta Chiaroli, AM, there, and have had a, enduring relationship.
And I first met my first Elena Callipari.
Yes.
The first one.
The first one, yeah, there are many. And of course I first met Fred. So part of the, we have a couple of interesting anecdotes. So as Loredana said, I didn't know Loredana. I turned up at the BSR, the British School at Rome, the day before the main event, the conference was happening. And with a bit of provoking, pushing from Eleanor, I met you. So you were there with Luisa Bercopo and a few others, setting up for the exhibition. So basically I was there to see the sewing machine.
But she wasn't the only person who was there doing the preview. Because...
So we got there and we come in and I'm looking at the sewing machine. It was amazing. Incidentally, the sewing machine was also has a link back to Calabria. We sort of found out that there were lots of links to Calabria, where my family is from. The sewing machine was sourced from an artist who was working in Rome, Sala Basta, who works with sewing and textiles as part of her practice. And it was the sewing machine of her grandmother, who was a sarta, or a dressmaker in Calabria. So that was pretty amazing. But then the day that we arrived to have a look at the sewing machine, someone came in and said, by the way,
the Queen's cousin is here and she's going to take a look around. So then we had to decide whether to curtsy or not to curtsy and stuff like that, which was not what we were in for. And then on the day of the actual launch of the exhibition, we had not one but 2 earthquakes. So it was a memorable event.
So the Queen's cousin was Princess Alexandra, who was really lovely, and we were told we had to curtsy and be, address her by Your Royal Highness. But when she found out that I was from Australia, she stuck out her hand and said, "Pleased to meet you." And I've been to Australia, Brisbane and Sydney, I think she'd said. So it was really lovely. She was very down to earth. So that was a bit like, oh my God, where am I? Very interesting.
So, and then as part of our exhibition in Rome, Lucy created a piece of art, which is also a piece of craft, and that is that apron. And I think it's interesting and it's significant that then that apron, which was made during that performance at the exhibition in Rome, has traveled all over the world. So it then went from there with the exhibition, it went to London, it came to New York, and there you see me wearing it in Genoa at one of the Diaspora Italiana conferences. So the art that has been created through this conversation is itself part then of that circulation.
Yeah, so the apron itself was made from a piece of embroidery that my mother made, prior to emigrating to Australia. It was the tradition for women to make their corredo or their glory box, so they would make their, all the things that they needed for their home. So there was a remnant piece that Mum had. It was from a pillowcase, so I used some pieces I embroidered, which you'll see actually later on. I'll point that out anyway. Little embroideries of Italy and Australia, and some other pieces of crochet and embroidery that I collected from my cousins in Italy, because before we got to Rome, we actually visited my cousins in Calabria, which was pretty amazing. So I'll move on. So these artworks that are up on the screen at the moment, they're interpretations of drawings of Calabrian proverbs, so Calabrese proverbs, which were things that my grandparents, my parents, friends and family, I put a call out to find out some. So they were then interpreted into embroideries as part of my performative practice. So there are a few there. One of them is Lupo, which I revisited again and again.
So the reason why I asked Lucy to use this particular slide is because it shows something that is specifically important for me, and again has been inspirational for me in the work that she does. And it's something also that is in common with a number of other artists that both Eliana and I have been interested in. And it's the use of words and of languages, plural, in visual art. So here it's the writing, the translation, the interpretation of Calabrese poems, and it's working with the vernacular Italian and then making it somehow visible in different ways through those arts, those skills, those sort of crafts that I was talking about before. Now, for me, that is precisely one of those things that I was talking about that have helped me to think about translation in a different way. So not as a substitution, not as erasing something and putting something else in there, but as a way of constructing traces, of tracing, literally tracing with a needle, but also of tracing histories backwards and forwards through time and through different generations and through places and through migrations and through itineraries. And it's a way, I think, a much more constructive way of thinking about how we translate ourselves, how we are asked to translate, how we reinterpret who we are. All of us, and I know that you can say that for yourself, all of us tell our own stories in different ways at different points in our lives. And it's not that we lie to ourselves, but those stories help us think and rethink who we are, how we got here, and also to imagine who we may be able to become. So that tracing and that going back to a language learned but not learned, heard but not heard, Filomena's work is so much about that gap, the famous 5 letters that you'll see upstairs, the in-between. That gap, that space, that does not have to be a space of loss and erasure, but can become instead a space of reinterpretation and reinvention. That's why I asked for that image there.
And almost finished. So this is just an example. So Loredana and I have said we've had a relationship for, we've known each other for a while. So out of our relationship, there was an opportunity for me to travel to the US in 2022. My works that are featured in this slide were part of an exhibition called Woven Lives Exploring Women's Needlework from the Italian Diaspora, which was shown at the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. So out of this opportunity, I applied for a grant from Regional Arts Victoria. Thank you, Regional Arts Victoria. And also I was supported by Stony Brook University, by Loredana, the Calandra Institute. I did a lecture there as well, which led to then being part of another project, which I'll show at the end. And finally, meeting B.
Yes, so the other feature in this is that I have been working not only with Australian Italian artists, but also with Italian American artists. One of them in particular, Bia Amore, was part also of the Rome exhibition. Her work was there. She was meant to be in Genoa with Filomena and Luci and myself and Fred. She couldn't because of her health reasons. But finally I managed to get together, not Filomena and B and Luci, but at least Luci and B in one room. And also another of my colleagues, Mary Jo Bona, whom Fred knows also very well. That meeting was incredibly significant, and Luci in particular did a lot of work with my students as well. During that workshop, we were sitting there, we were talking about our experiences as diasporic women, and at one point, talking about objects, I said I'd say a bit more about objects, the question came up, okay, what objects are significant to you? All of us, well no, all 3 of you, it wasn't, I didn't, but all 3, B, Mary Jo, and Luci, went to something they were wearing and said, this was my grandmother's. And the audience, there were a lot of young women there, many of them from diasporic backgrounds, not necessarily Italian American. There were Asian American students there, there were Hispanic American, and they were so moved. And one of them then had this real breakthrough, and she said, okay, how do I get rid of the shame that I'm carrying? Because I haven't kept enough of my connection to that story. And that was so interesting because we often think, I'm looking at Fred, and we often hear stories of generations of migrants who were shamed for their being migrants. But what I hear now in the next generation, in the students that I teach, it's a different kind of story. It's a story where they're trying to negotiate how to be part of that tradition without being trapped by it, how to be in between cultures and make something beautiful, something positive out of that, instead of carrying shame for that. And again, I think that's where Luci's work, where Filomena's work, you'll hear more about that in a second, are really, really important and really significant, constructing those spaces.
Okay, so let's move along. Finally. So this is, Loredana mentioned earlier, the collective crochet workshops, I suppose, that I've done over the years. So it's, it started here in Mildura and it went on to, it's been to Melbourne a couple of times, Los Angeles, Staten Island, that's Canberra earlier this year, the last slide at the bottom. And this is a video that I took at Stony Brook. So this is with Loredana's students. They were all crocheting. Some of them had never crocheted before. And there's Loredana at the end. So it continues to travel. And this is the work that was created from those findings or artefacts or crochet chains was transformed into an artwork tracing threads and story and weaving stories, which that was shown towards the end of that year. I was part of a group exhibition in Redcliffe at Workspace 3496. And also part of that trip, I decided, so this is a project that I did in collaboration with Ascolta Women Inc., who are a group of writers who I'm part of. So Ascolta Women is a collective of nearly 60 creative multi-generation Italian-Australian and Italian-affiliated women from across Australia, London and also Canada. And so I put a call out to interested members of Ascolta. This is called La Donna Rossa. So everyone was sent a little postcard size piece of art paper, some red thread and crochet thread, and they each interpreted the theme La Donna Rossa in their own way.
And I think we're closing with that because we said at the start, this is a conversation. We've taken you, in half an hour, we've taken you over 10 years of conversations, 10 years of joint work and of inspiration that we've taken from each other. And for me, this work, the work that I've been able, again, thanks to Luci, thanks to Maria, thanks to others, I've been able to watch at a distance the work of the Ascolta group, for instance, of the Ascolta women. This is, for me, a stage in a continuing conversation. It's also something that underlines the importance of how we can think about our stories, we can think about these narratives, we can think about these conversations as a way in which the past that we come from, the stories that we carry, even the shame that we carry, can be transformative and can make our memories future-making. This is something I constantly say to my students. Memory is not nostalgia. Thinking about where we came from is not being stuck in the past. It's only through memory that we can build the future. And for me, that's the important message, and that's where we are now. So here's to the next 10 years of conversations.
Jessie, Filomena's.
You're going to put that up, so that's up when you talk.
It's up.
Oh, it is up. Okay. Like most of you, I grew up in a world in which art was outside of my house. Art was something other people did. Art was a place, were in places you went to, not the places you were. You go to a museum, you go to church. And what do you learn in those encounters? You learn warnings. If you sin, you will be in this painting. If you tell a lie, you will be in this painting. And this, to me, was art when I was growing up. And it created, the world I grew up in was not only art is outside, but it's a very literal world. You didn't speak figuratively. You said what you needed to say and you went on. There was no time for figurative language. What we didn't learn in that world, and it took us to leave that world and to come back to it, was that art, we were surrounded by arts. There was art in the embroidery on our couches. There was art in the doilies in the kitchen, in the tablecloths. There was art in the food. There was art in the backyard. Now, one of the things we have learned to do in the last 10 years is to acknowledge the first custodians of the land that we live on. This was something my grandfather taught me when I was very young, was how to take care of the land. My grandfather was indigenous to southern Italy. He was not indigenous to the United States. That transplantation from him, from Italy to the United States, created an incredible disruption. A disruption, it put him in a place where most of what he knew as culture would not exist. And what did he do? He found the places that it could exist. He found it in his backyard. He found it in his basement where he made his wine. He found it in the forest preserves, in the trees, when we would go dig dandelions and get puffballs and pick mushrooms. My experience in education took me as far away from my grandfather and my grandmother that whole life as possible. There was nothing Italian about my education. My education took place a little bit of Columbus and a lot of Capone. Those were the two C's. One taught us who discovered America, the other taught us how to get away with murder in it. And both of them were lies. But they remain today some of the biggest reasons why Italian Americans still identify as Italian Americans. And to me, that is the greatest shame that we have. And what I have done in the work that I have been doing since I first realized that school was lying to me and I wanted to find the truth. When I started to find my truth and brought it to my school told me it was a lie. Italian Americans don't read. Italian Americans don't have stories. You need to read Henry James. He lived in Italy. You need to read Hawthorne. He lived in Italy. And battling that all my life created this figure that Italian America doesn't even know what to do with. If I was a Jew, I'd be a rabbi. Jews know what to do with rabbis. Rabbis interpret the culture and keep the documents alive from the culture to let people know this is what it means to be a Jew. Try doing that as an Italian American. Let Italian Americans, they don't want to be told how to do anything, let alone how to be an Italian American. And so the work that I have been doing, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a reading from it, led me to begin the journey that Loredana and Luci just recounted, where I became this kind of educated master of life in Italian life in America, United States. Then I started meeting people from Canada, and their life was different. Then I started meeting people from South America. Oh my God, you still speak Italian? How did that happen? My grandparents were told, don't speak the language of the enemy during World War II, and all kinds of propaganda. And both my grandparents were enemy aliens. They had to check in with the government throughout the early years, first 2 years of the war. What happened then was, by the time I learned to speak Italian, I learned that it was no good to speak Italian. And even a few times when we did speak Italian in the school, the nuns washed my mouth out with soap. I don't know if they've ever done that here in schools years ago. If you said bad words, they would wash your mouth out with soap. If you were caught speaking Italian, and it happened to me. And let me tell you, the soap that she used was not pure white Dove soap. And it was not this organic soap we have today where you don't know whether to eat it or wipe it on your body. It was lye, and it had dirt in the edges of it. And she took me into that janitor's closet and washed my, and I did not speak Italian again in that school. Of course we were speaking, because we knew the nuns didn't understand us, we were speaking the language. But that is exactly how dialect survived in Italy. Italy, most people don't understand. Italy is this beautiful country, Bella Italia. It was a country that was occupied by foreign forces for centuries. So the behavior, gestures, all those things that we think, oh, that's Italian. That's a way of speaking so that the people in charge don't know what you're talking about. And so my parents would think, all right, we'll speak Italian because the kids don't know. But I was the firstborn in America, and I was the only one who understood. And so I have learned that I have a story that I have to tell. And like the custodians of the land, I have to take care of my story. And today I'm going to share a little bit of that story with you that I'll pick up off the floor. Now, the title of the book is A Generation Removed. It won't be a book for a while, but this is the work that Filomena and I have been and will continue to collaborate on. And she said something yesterday when, and we're going to talk about this collaboration a little bit more. When you begin to collaborate with somebody on work that you have already created, you realize, I don't own this anymore. This is not me. And we always think of the artist as somebody who is above the community. The artist is this individual who, you know, it's like the star of a team, you know, like the quarterback. Well, I didn't play quarterback when I was a kid. I played on the line. And I knew if I made one false move, I could kill that quarterback. So it takes a whole group of people. And this is the one thing that I have learned, and it's taken that kind of ego out of my art that probably kept my art from reaching different other levels. And so I have great expectations for it. So it's entitled A Generation Removed. Now, I am a generation removed from the migrant experience. It was my grandparents who migrated to the United States. But I am the first generation connected to the diaspora. And the story that Loredana and Luci just told you about how we began to meet and work, and you know, is the reason why I traveled 16,830 kilometers from New York yesterday, or 2 days ago, or 3. I don't even know how many days it takes to get here. I came here because I feel like I belong here. And that was because of the conference that we did years ago in Melbourne, which was born out of the initial conference where I met Luci and Laura. Well, I actually knew Loredana long before that. But the idea is that your story might mean something in your hometown. But when you begin to hear the story of other people from other hometowns, you begin to say, hey, we have a community. And this is what indigenous culture teaches people. It's not, I'm an indigenous person, I am a human being. The more we understand our connections to our own indigenous roots through, today we're start doing it through art, but you can do it through food, through whatever it is, the more we begin to understand the humanness of other people. And that's what brings us together. That's what connects us together. So I am not an Italian American. I'm an Italian diaspora. And to me, you know, the day I leave here, I have 2 days back in New York, and then I go to Genoa for the next installment of this conference, which is a conversation, which I hope will continue forever. I don't plan to be there at every single conference, but until I die, I will be. So this is called, I'm going to read you just a few minutes from this book, and then I'm going to tell you what Filomena did to this. My grandparents poured into me all the Italy they couldn't fit into their children. To others, they spoke broken English, but to me, the firstborn grandchild, it was always their Italian. So I became the only one who could understand them. As they neared retirement, I was placed in their care on those rare occasions that my parents weren't around. I was their assistant who ran errands and extended their reach. My life became an internship into the ways they thought, the ways they felt, and the ways they got things done. Their ways of doing and being were always explained more through stories than any detailed instructions. Nonno was an immigrant who had never really arrived, one who carried the burlap sack of his past wherever he went, a weight that slowed him down in the fast-moving modern America of television and astronauts. Whatever Italy was to me in my youth came from him. He reflected the dual image of my Italian heritage, one of pride, yet one of embarrassment. Images that constantly fought one another in my mind. His broken English upset me, especially when he would speak like this to me when I was with my non-Italian American friends, the ones he's called the Marigans. His Italian, that strange tongue that he would use when spurred to a highly emotional point in an argument, while reminiscing with old friends or when he didn't want his kids to understand what he was saying, always enchanted me. His language was only one way in which he conflicted with the America I was growing up in. At breakfast, he'd be hunched over a ceramic bowl filled with chunks of stale bread, the kind that Mrs. Rossi used to throw out to the birds in her backyard. I watched in disbelief as he poured hot coffee over the bread, then added scalded milk and sugar to the mixture. Then he'd eat it. While he ate, I gathered the courage to spill some cornflakes into my blue Tupperware bowl and eat the American breakfast I had known from television. He offered me a taste of his concoction, which I rudely refused to his amusement. When I looked into his smile, I lost the image I had had of him when I first saw him pour that coffee over the old bread. In that closeness I loved, but I still didn't understand the immigrant inside the man. Nono never used the products I thought were essential to American life. He bragged that he had never used shampoo or toothpaste, and yet managed to keep a full head of beautiful hair and a mouth free of fillings. I was amazed, since by the age of 10 I had already been noticing my dandruff and had visited the dentist more than he ever had his whole 70 years of life. He preferred to grow his own vegetables, while I'd be fascinated by the ease of picking unblemished, even-sized tomatoes and other produce neatly wrapped in plastic off of supermarket shelves. And I'd be frustrated by the hours I would spend with him in his garden, sweating to produce a few tomatoes and peppers, and following him through fields of forest preserves, picking dandelion greens and poking puffballs down from trees. Nonna was always a center of attention during the preparation of Sunday afternoon meals. She ruled and hollered out orders from to the women in her family from the kitchen. But my attention always turned to Nonno while we ate. He fascinated me, using bread and fingers to gather the sauce that slid off the spaghetti, tonguing neck bones until they were meatless and dry. He could make me forget I had food in front of me. He was a noisy eater, but the sounds he made were hardly noticeable amid the loud talk at our table. He rationed the salad of bitter dandelion greens by dancing around the table and dropping them onto the plates. Then he would return to his seat, hug the huge wooden bowl with one arm, and shovel forkfuls of the greens into his mouth. When the storm of the meal had blown over, he would sit back and smoke an unfiltered cigarette, right there at the kitchen table, often with the lit end in his mouth. Magic, we used to think. Nonno never learned to read or write, and I would feel so important when he ordered me to read something for him. I was the American he could never be. I was proof that his hopes of making it in America had been fulfilled. Nonno never told me why he had left Italy and rarely talked of his childhood. I guess he thought it was enough to be in America, and that all that had come before no longer made any difference in his new home. After he died, Sunday dinners were never the same. With him were buried many of the Italian traditions of our family that had followed his lead. Without his influence, Italians quickly became strangers in a collage of media images: spicy meatball eaters, Godfather gangsters, and operatic buffoons. But he did leave me with a curiosity of what the old country was like. One day, the year before he died, he and I were on a beach in Southern California. Our family had traveled to visit my Uncle Pasquale's home after my father's funeral. Nonno sat on the sand, staring into the sun's reflection off the waves. He said, "This beach, she like a monopoly," a coastal town near Castellana Grotte in southeastern Italy where he was born. "Una day I'm going to go back to Castellana." He said nothing else the rest of the day. He was silent for hours as though in a trance. It was a look I had never seen before, and it frightened me. I covered him with sand, and he sat there until the tide washed it away. He was burned quite badly, but it didn't seem to bother him. He had been in Italy during those hours. It had been more than 50 years since he had seen the land where he came from. And whenever I pictured Nonno after he died, it was with that sad smile he had on his face that day on the beach. As I turned my energies towards pursuing an education and the pleasures of being a teenager, the memories of Grandpa weakened. I often lost my family in my growing disenchantment with the American way. In the late 1970s, I decided to get as far away from my family as possible. I planned a trip to Europe to visit friends in Denmark and Sweden. But as I gathered the addresses, I thought it might be interesting to visit Italy for a few days, if I could find the time. Nonna had retained only Christmas card contact with the other family in Castellano. She had the address of Nonno's brother, and I wrote him. By the time I left, I had not received a response and wondered if I should bother to stop in Castellano at all. I'm going to stop there. The novel is built with alternating chapters. The next story tells the story of my grandfather coming to the United States, his last day in Castellano. And then the next story is my first day in Castellano. The next day is him learning English. The next is me learning Italian, because what I found out was that I who was not allowed to be American in the United States, was also not allowed to be Italian in Italy. And this experience was incredibly traumatic. I mean, I can understand being Italian in the United States. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood and so on. I tried to be American. Even the American clothes couldn't fit me. Boy Scout outfit, I looked like a stuffed sausage in a Boy Scout outfit. And so I said, you know, maybe when I go to Italy, then I'll find a place where I belong. Now, when I first went to Castellano, I was the first of our family to go back, and my uncle said, "What the hell are you going to go back there for?" You know, it's just, you know, whenever I would ask my grandmother, you know, about, you know, she said, "Miseria." That's all she would say. "Grandma, how was Italy?" "Miseria." She wouldn't even go beyond that. So, you know, I thought miseria was like some kind of disease or something that you would catch if you went to Italy. But when I went to Italy, it was the first time in my life that I felt home. And I didn't know anybody there. But I felt home. I could feel it. And you know, for young boys in America who are taught not to feel, to have those kind of feelings, it's a scary thing. So when I started sending a little bit of this work out, I had met Filomena at the Closet, the first Diaspora Italiana conference, 2018 in Melbourne. And I began to see her work and talk to her about, and I began to see inside of her painting the same thing that I was trying to do. And it's all about this journey of identity, this journey of how connected am I to my family, how connected am I to my country, and where does the word culture fit in? And so, I don't know, maybe she'll be able to tell you a little bit better about, I don't remember sending it to her. Mm-hmm. And we began to exchange, and she did something that nobody had ever done to my work. She responded to my work in an artistic way. I mean, I've had people, you know, with a red pen correct my work and things like that, but nobody had added on to my work. And I thought, oh my God, this is. And from there, we moved into the next stage, which she said, okay, I have entered your work with my art. It's time for you to enter my work with your art. What's my art? My art is language. I mean, I always wanted to be, you know, a singer, a Beatle, you know, all that, Elton John. But I never had the discipline to get the 10,000 hours you needed to do to be able to do that. But for me, it was language. And so when she said, you must put words on my art, it violated all the trauma taboos that I had encountered. The first time I was ever brought to an art museum in school, it was a school trip. And at that time I didn't know that I was colorblind. And I went to touch a painting because the painting came off the canvas. And I thought, I'd never seen brushstrokes in my life. you know, all the artwork that we saw, everything we saw. I mean, maybe if I looked better, I would have seen them, but it came off like waves. And all I wanted to do was just run my fingers across it. And a nun grabbed my hand and slapped it as hard. So art you don't touch. When I was very young, I got in all kinds of trouble because we couldn't afford crayons, and so we had to use the common crayon box in school, the big box, which had all the colors, names. You know, you just picked the crayon and you drew. Whereas the rich kids in our school had their little boxes of Crayolas with the names on them and little sharpeners in the box, and you could lift them up, and it was just, you know. But so I would just draw painting, and then we'd draw pictures, and one of the assignments we had was to draw the scene outside our window at school. When I was done, I was pretty happy with what I had, and the nun came over, and she picked it up, and she looked at it, and she shook it like this, like it was, she was, you know, it made a sound. And she said, "Everybody, look at this. The sky is not purple, the sun is not orange, the grass is not brown unless nobody waters it. This is what I don't want you to do." And she did this in front of the whole class. That was the first and last time I ever tried to draw anything, color anything, have anything to do with art. So imagine my shock in trying to figure out a way to get into this artwork. And Filomena is the encouragement, and what she had done to my work. It's like, okay, you could do that to my work, I'll do this to your work. And so that's where we stand right now. And she's going to illustrate this book, A Generation Removed, once I get it. It's almost done. And then we'll see where it goes from there.
Okay.
All right.
I think on that colourblind note, the first thing you sent to me when we talked about this collaboration was an email with 2 attachments, which were 2 chapters of the book. And as a visual artist, I thought, what am I going to do? There are a lot of words, and I didn't know whether to illustrate and make pictures about this story. And I thought about it, and it was in the time of lockdown. So it was in the midst, it's July 2020, so we're in the middle of a year of lockdown. I was in Mildura with my mum, looking after my father, and everything was closed, so I hadn't brought any art materials with me. So I was in this sort of moment of thinking, what can this collaboration be? As intimidated as Fred is by the visual arts, I have been intimidated by the written word my whole life and was questioned about doing English in HSC because I spoke Italian at home. If anyone's here from Tasmania, I never submitted my master's paper into the university library as you're supposed to because I still have that fear of the written word. So the thought of working with someone of Fred's reputation with his words, I wasn't sure where to go. So I read the story, and in reading the story, it became really clear that the story he was writing about his grandfather was very similar to the story I have with my father, and that his being grandchild of that first migration, I was child of that first migration. So in this incredibly intense time of COVID, of lockdown, of my father not well, and reading Fred's stories about his grandfather, I started speaking to my father a lot more, and it was the first time I looked at this story of migration through the patriarchal line of my family. So in reading Fred's first chapter, which is about his grandfather, I responded to him saying, and at this point you've edited since then, he was calling him Grandpa. I said, "Your grandpa reminds me of my father." So it was this really strong moment of connection to trying to understand migration from that point of view, and also trying to understand my father as a woman born into this culture, and in this incredible time where, you know, I didn't have any of my materials that I normally would make art with. I had stitched before, and I remember getting this first chapter, so I was able to get it printed at Officeworks on slightly thicker paper. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, I'll just stitch on it and I'll respect the type and the black and white, and knowing that Fred was colourblind, I thought I would do it in white thread. But I remember this incredible moment of beginning to pierce the paper and wondering how Fred would respond, because in a way you're breaking up someone's words, you're moving through them and in and out of this piece of paper and imposing and imprinting, in a way, my own story. So it became this really kind of, for me, important connection, but this incredible fear about when I sent it to Fred, what he would think about this, the way that I had responded to his work, and whether he would feel offended that I had pierced the work and sometimes covered the words and maybe imposed too much of myself in his story. So this is the first chapter that Fred has read from. The second chapter is when his grandfather is leaving Italy, and the moment of that journey to the United States. My grandfather actually probably went through Ellis Island at about the same time, and went through Ellis Island a couple of times. So this period of Fred's grandfather's migration was very similar to my grandfather, but he actually returned to Italy. So in the second chapter, I covered part of his words, again, very nervously, with the maps of the two countries. And I said, my nonno returned to Italy and remained. Australia was in his son's future, my father. And in this chapter, it's the only chapter that I included an image, and that image is taken from the pier at Fremantle, where they would have first arrived when they landed in Australia and cleared customs. So it was this sort of, I don't know, I feel that somehow through Fred's story of his father and himself, his grandfather, and himself, somehow it was helping me understand my father's journey and my father's movements to this country, and how he might have felt, because my father was not someone who expressed a lot about himself, and like many migrants, didn't share a lot of that. He was so proud of what he had done since he arrived here, and he would sit and tell everyone who would listen what he had done since he arrived here. He was so proud of what he'd built for his family and and his life here, but to try and understand the difficulty of what he had come from has come through Fred's stories. And so chapter 3 is Fred returning to Italy at this point. So it's just his first step back to Italy. And it brought back to me the very first time, well actually the first time I went as an adult to Italy, where I responded to Fred saying, feeling so connected to the Italian landscape, I cried. And I remember just being driven through Italy when I arrived and seeing the landscape and seeing the trees and those cypress trees and this undulating landscape, because I had been born here in Mildura and I know it's so open and people love the open space, but I always felt claustrophobic here because I couldn't see beyond anything, and I felt so enclosed. And then going to Italy and seeing this undulation and seeing hills and seeing trees on the hills and knowing there was something beyond was this incredible sense of openness and connection. And then the fourth chapter is very much about language. So this is very close to me in what I spoke about language, but also in the way that my grandfather, the first 2 pages, this is the only chapter I've embroidered over all 4 pages of the chapter. And the left panel is actually a floor plan of Ellis Island. And these are my nonno's records from Ellis Island. So on question 7 is, are you able to read or write? And of course his was marked with no. he could not. So again, the no is in the white paper covering Fred's words. And then the second part was when I was talking to Dad, he was saying that during World War II, the men were sent to war, so no teachers remained in the villages. And so the schools closed and my dad was in La Seconda Classe. So it was really interesting through having these stories. And I think we were in 2020, so it was also kind of that 100 years since the war. So there was all these sort of war stories on the news and this sort of remembrance of that time. And so these were the kind of moments of stories that I captured from him as we were in those lockdowns and in those stories and in those moments of being able to share information and share stories. And then the final chapter so far, so this is still in like 2021, and it's when Fred has returned to his village and he's seeing the names of his ancestors on a war memorial. And it reminded me of when I went to Italy and I saw the name Coppola on gravestones. And I said, seeing Coppola on a gravestone, my story was greater than one generation in Australia. So that understanding that I never had grandparents in Australia, so it was my parents and me, so it was this connection back to this extended family that I didn't really know, that I knew belonged there. At this point, my father was still with us, so this is where we've stopped. And I don't know what comes next in the book.
What comes next is chapter 6.
That's right. And life. So this is kind of that moment for me of anticipation of not knowing how this next part will be, or what will happen, or what my responses will be, because I'll be making these without my father. So that is just what happens with life and that continuation. And this is what is so important about these stories and about sharing memories and about acknowledging past and our histories. And then in response to Fred, there's some works upstairs, the most recent works I made, which are called In My Father's Garden. So because Fred made me do this project, I felt compelled to impose the same sense of trauma that I felt, which is Fred's word trauma, that I felt on stitching through his works. And when he got off the plane yesterday, he was whisked to my mother's house to, I've printed these on photographic paper, so there's 6 drawings upstairs that are titled In My Father's Garden, and they are all bugs, which some of them are friendly, some of them not so much, and they each have a word in them mirrored and shadowed in Italian, which is about our connection to both places, our connection to both languages, and our connection to nature. And so this, Fred, is your part.
Right, and so...
And we have about 2 minutes.
That's all I need, because I was totally stymied by this assignment, because to put something on another, I mean, works of art, what we were taught are complete, finished things, and by putting things on them, to me it's like, you know, putting graffiti on walls. You're destroying the the integrity of the work, or disrupting the integrity of the work. My instinct when I saw these insects were, I think there's 6, right? There's 6 insects. I just remember the first time I ever encountered these insects, the cicada. Where I lived in Illinois, outside of Chicago, last year they just had the every 10 years, whatever it is, when they all come out. And you can't hear yourself think in your home when this happens. And when you walk outside, it's even louder. You can't hear anybody, your neighbors in the yards talking and so on. And so it was kind of a pesty kind of thing. But it was the whole idea of the sound. So I took these responses very kind of literal, going back to my idea of the literal culture that I come from. But, you know, had I been given this assignment when I was a young boy, I probably would have just put, you know, with the mosquito that I saw. I mean, I've never seen anything good come from a mosquito. H.L. Mencken wrote an essay about the mosquito, which I learned a lot, and I didn't realize it's only the female mosquitoes that bite. The male mosquitoes don't bite. I never stopped to look to see if I was killing a female or a female. I just killed mosquitoes. I mean, that was the goal. And I remember when they came up with this new thing in one of the restaurants, outside one of the restaurants, where it was a machine with lights and sound, and it would zap these. You know, every time one would get in there, it would kill them. And so those were the kinds of reactions that I had to all of these. I live in a pretty interesting area of Long Island, but one of the problems that in my particular area is we are inundated with moths. And I didn't realize that it's, you know, by the time the moth has its wings, that's not the thing that eats your clothes. It's the eggs that they lay and the larvae that come out. And I've had very good clothes ruined. So when I saw the moth, I said, "Che mangiala," you know, it eats the wool, and you know, so all the bad things. But then, the more I thought about it, and it was because of the way Filomena presented them in her art, and not because of the words that she has inscribed around there, but it also made me see things I had never seen before. So for me, this was a kind of a call-response activity where I didn't want to just do something literally. I also moved to the figurative. And to me, it shows a great, I mean, I haven't hit a mosquito since I saw this. I mean, fortunately, where I live, we don't have a lot of mosquitoes. I live near the sea, and the ocean breezes really keep mosquitoes away. But the last time I had a mosquito on me, I did something that one of my friends taught me how to do, which was just tighten up your skin, and the mosquito can't leave. You keep it there. And you kind of look at it, and you can have a conversation with it. And then either you let it go. I mean, because, you know, by the time they got their needle in you, killing them is not going to, you know, but I always wondered, because I'm a big believer in blood donor. I'm a regular blood donor. And I always wonder, where did my blood go with that mosquito? So these are the experiences that I had in doing it, and it was incredibly fun. Even though it was scary yesterday when I had to actually put these things down in places. And I'm a Virgo, I'm very organized, and so you could probably begin to see the shapes. But I didn't think about that until today when I saw one of these, the shape of my writing around, you know, and how I put it there. So that's 2 minutes.
Okay, so I believe that we have wrapped up our conversation and we can open up to the audience for questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Antoinette and Janae have mics that they can pass to you, so feel free. And I should say thank you. I forgot that bit. Thanks.
Thank you.
I was just really curious, we had a conversation earlier today just about your curatorial decisions about how the exhibition was, like it was very considered, and I'd just like to know a little bit more about that.
I think with the work and with this exhibition, I've always really wanted those three works together, and this was the second application. So the first one I kind of didn't quite get it, and then Lucy said, what about mother tongue? And I wasn't sure, which is the thing with most artists, is when you've shown art in a space before, if you can show it again. So when she said mother tongue, I thought, right, I know what I'm doing now. And so because I've lived here, I knew those two spaces so well up there. And I wanted to have the conversation about cultural loss, and about the cultural loss which is addressed in those three works, which is Chasing the Disappeared, Mother Tongue, which has been reworked to fit on that wall, and began with that the big drawing, the framed work, Wallflower Mirror Mirror, which was the first one when my uncle passed in 2013. So that triggered all this work about the community cultural loss. And then the final work, Alpha Sound, well, Mother Tongue, which has the sound and the video piece, and then Alpha Sound, which has the sound wave of my voice speaking the alphabet. And so I knew I wanted those three works together. And then along with that, those 5 letters of the alphabet, there's a print in the foyer, which I think it's like 2010 is the first time I used those 5 letters. And to me, they have always been that space of absence and presence, where it's both without being both, and without being able to identify as both, because they're neither present or not present. And in as well as that work, it was also the fact that my father had passed. So the idea of cultural loss then became personal grief. And in making the works, the new works, which are mostly about my father, it is about looking at the cycle of life, and that and I always say this, when things happen in the right order, and he passed in the right order, there is so much joy and so much love, and with love comes grief, and grief comes out of love, and with gratitude, and with the sharing of what he brought here and what he gave to us by coming here, by leaving his family to come here. And so the story in that work is, as much as it's my story, I hope it's more of a general story. And in Alpha Sound, we did the public program on Saturday where we are asking members of the community to come in and write their name on it, their surnames, their family names. So it becomes a collection of the migration to this area. And I really, as much as I know it's my work, I know I made it, but it's not my story. It's a story that belongs to everybody, and I hope people feel it. And I had a woman say to me the other day, and she was just flicking through the catalogue, and she said, every time I see a butterfly, it's my father. And I said to her, they're actually about my father. And so that moment, it's like these triggers are there for everyone. And so those 5 letters and those stories and the works and the cups that we share those communications over, the knots that are in the stitched work are the knots that bind and the knots that free us as well. And so all those works combined, I hope, carry that story, which for me is everyone's story. There are so many different, I mean, I look here and I work with people here that come from so many different cultural backgrounds. So I hope that anyone who comes from any nationality will be able to feel the sentiment and the joy and the melancholy and the pleasure, and I think a bit of pain as well. I think in those stories in the video, you can feel the grief, but you can feel the joy and you can feel the gratitude, and I hope the work carries that as well.
Okay, before everyone disappears, let me just, firstly, no other questions? That's okay. Oh, there is just a Janae.
You sort of partly answered my question, but I was going to say, why insects? Like, to me, Italy is about goats, bulls, food chains, sheep, and that sort of stuff.
Could you just say the last bit again? I couldn't catch it.
Why insects? You partly answered it when you said it was about butterflies, it was about your parents, but why all insects in the pictures? Why not like goats? To me, I'm not Italian, but I played soccer with Italians, I grew up with Italians. you know what I mean? I was like an Italian. They think I'm Italian. But to me, goats, they always talk about goats. And they're goats. Bulls, why not a goat? I love goats, you know what I mean? They're all insects.
Yeah.
That's all. I was wondering, sort of partially answered, but the mosquitoes, other things you could have chosen, that's all.
Well, the insects, those 6 works are called In My Father's Garden. And for me, the insects are about the idea that these things, these little things, are often pests, but often very beautiful. And there is a struggle within them that carries that. And for me, the mosquito was, I had a fight with that drawing, like a serious fight, because I couldn't understand the structure of the mosquito for a start. So then I understood science fiction movies, because so much of those critters are based on the movement of those mosquitoes. And I really don't like mosquitoes. But in drawing that, she became so beautiful. And in the struggle to work out how she worked and how she could actually move and exist, I fell in love with her. And I think that's what those bugs are, that as much as they are such a pest, we can't be without them. So it's about that balance in the same way that I find is my cultural balance. I can't be Italian, I can't be Australian, I can't love these bugs, but I can't hate these bugs either. So that to me is so much a part of how when you garden, you are always in a struggle with some element of nature.
I just wanted a goat, I think.
Next one. Or maybe I could be the greatest of all time. Can we have one of those goats?
Okay, so now I do invite you to go have a look at the exhibition, 5 Letters, Cinque Lettere. It's in our first 4 galleries, and also you can explore Revista and our other exhibitions. The exhibition opening officially opens at 5 o'clock tonight, so you're welcome to stay on. You can grab a cafe in the Vista Cafe bar, or you can more than welcome to head off and then come back. But please join me in thanking our panel for a beautiful conversation today. Wonderful. Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Oh my God.